This cycle alone, we have several hundred Indian American candidates running for local, city, state, county, as well as federal positions. Too many at this time for us even to keep track of. And finally, we are the fastest growing minority in the United States, with several 100,000 people in queue, people who have green cards who are now in the process of becoming citizens. And then we have several 100,000 more of our people who have applied for green cards and are now waiting to get them. So if you project our population over the next several years, you'll see that the Indian minority community is the fastest growing one in the United States. So as a result of this, I think you'll see both parties and candidates are vying for our attention of our community and our citizens and our voters. And as I can joke only in this community here, that candidates are even learning how to pronounce our names, whether it's Karthik or Milan or Niraj or Seema, they're learning to pronounce our names properly the way our mothers and fathers used to pronounce our names, okay? And so I think that shows that we've come of age. Some of the rules today and the agenda, we will have Karthik Ramakrishnan go first, who is our partner at AAPI Data. We're so delighted to partner with them. Following Karthik, we'll have Milan Vaishnav really host a panel of both Democrats and Republicans to opine on the survey results. And then finally, we'll be able to use the Q&A box. All of you in the attendee list will be able to use the Q&A box to fire questions at this eminent panel. So that's the agenda for today. And now I'm delighted to turn it over to my dear friend, Karthik Ramakrishnan with UC Riverside and with AAPI Data. Take it away, Karthik.
Great. Thank you, Amar. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And these data are hot off the presses, or whatever it looks like in the digital world. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Oh, you know what? It looks like we went. Okay, so everyone's able to see my screen, I hope, and I can't see everyone. So if there's anything, someone give me a verbal cue. Delighted to partner with Indiaspora here and AAPI Data. And I'll just get right to the results. So in terms of the background, Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group in the country, and Indian Americans among them are the fastest within that fastest growing category if you look at the large Asian American groups. In terms of the number of Indian Americans, depends on how you count them. If you look just at the Asian alone population, these are people who are not multiracial. That's 4.16 million. But for those who count themselves as Indian and some other race, or Asian and some other race, someone like Kamala Harris, for example, that number is 4.5 million. API Data found that, oh, you know what? This is not my latest thing, but okay, hopefully this turns out okay. We found that the Asian alone population right now, when we project, Indian Americans are likely the largest Asian American group. If we project beyond 2018, which is the latest data that we have, there are actually more Indian alone than Chinese alone Asian Americans in the country. Other aspects of the background, we've had record high turnout in 2018 for the Indian American population, and we're likely going to see that continue. Importantly, Indian Americans are growing in importance in many competitive states and congressional districts. And when we talk about immigrant voters, what's important nationally to know is that there are about as many Asian Americans that are naturalized citizens that are eligible to vote, and also that are registered to vote as you have Latinos. And so that's important whenever anyone talks about the immigrant vote, they have to talk about Asian Americans and not just Latino voters. In terms of the Asian American Voter Survey, it was fielded between July 15th and September 10th. Support in various languages. For Indian Americans, it was done only in English. It was conducted by telephone and online. And you had 260, this is a typo here, we'll get that fixed, Indian American respondents for margin of error of plus or minus 6%. In terms of voter enthusiasm, I'll just focus on the Indian American thing here and note any changes from the Asian American average. Very enthusiastic, so 58% or more enthusiastic this year than in the past. In terms of how they identify with political parties, Indian Americans are among those that are the strongest Democratic leaning. 54% identify as D versus 16% as Republican. And in terms of vote choice, on the House race, strongly in favor of the Democratic candidate as opposed to the Republican candidate. In Senate races, it's a little bit, it's a constrained set of cases where we have Senate races this year, but even there, Indian Americans strongly favor Democrats over Republicans. In the presidential race, we find that Indian Americans tend to be the strongest supporters of Joe Biden, although Donald Trump has made headway since 2016, where he had 16% of the vote. He's already at 28% of the vote now. And we project that if the undecideds break in the same ratio, that he will probably get 30% of the Indian American vote. In terms of favorability, Indian Americans have the highest favorability among all Asian groups for Joe Biden. And then when it comes to Donald Trump, they're the third highest, but what you'll see is that 53% of Indian American registered voters have a very unfavorable impression of Donald Trump, and that really limits his ability to make much more headway in the Indian American population. In terms of policy priorities, jobs in the economy, healthcare and education tend to be near the top. And on jobs in the economy, Indian Americans tend to favor the Democrats over Republicans, although among Asian Americans overall, there's slightly more favor in terms of Republicans over Democrats. On healthcare, if this is a healthcare election, Indian Americans strongly favor Democrats over Republicans. And on education as well. On all these, you'll see Indian Americans near the top in terms of their favoring of the Democratic Party, as well as on various issues, tend to be among the most progressive. So I'll get to that in terms of policy preferences. There's a lot of talk about big government versus small government. Indian Americans tend to favor bigger government, providing more services rather than smaller government, providing fewer services, tend to be the most progressive there. And you'll see a consistent pattern. Supporting healthcare for all immigrants, Indian Americans at the top of the list among Asian American groups, strongly in favor, strongly support a pathway to citizenship. So this is something, of course, you have about 19% who disagree with the pathway to citizenship, but the overwhelming majority support a pathway to citizenship. On climate change, very strong support, especially I'm out here in California. We are feeling the effects of climate change. Indian Americans are strongly in favor of federal policies to reduce the effects of climate change or global warming. Support for stricter gun laws, again, tend to be the most progressive on this issue. Now, turning a bit to some of the worries and COVID-related matters, Indian Americans are worried about election interference, and we'll get to COVID in a minute. I just want to say a little bit about discrimination. There's a lot of talk about discrimination against Asian Americans. Indian Americans don't see that as a major issue compared to some others, probably because they're not feeling as much of the hate crimes this time around as they have in the past. But they do think there's a lot of discrimination against Black people in America and against Muslims. So there's a lot of talk about, are we seeing a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment coming up in the Indian American population? We don't see evidence of that, and they see that discrimination against Muslims is a significant problem in our society today. You also see strong support for civil rights, giving African Americans equal rights with whites, as well as for reallocating police funds to shifting them from law enforcement to social programs. Affirmative action, this is another issue in which Indian Americans are strongly in favor. And then finally, on COVID-related challenges, they worry about the affordability of healthcare. They worry about hate crimes. And this is interesting, but maybe it's because they're worrying about hate crimes for others and not necessarily for themselves. They do say that, the most likely to say that they have received financial help from friends and family in the last year. They have also assisted family members in the last year. Finally, in terms of inability to pay bills, they're slightly above the Asian American average, but not the highest. They're also 27% say that they've delayed a medical visit in the last 12 months for financial reasons. So that's what we have here in terms of our survey results. And I'll turn it over back to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Karthik. And the full report that Karthik covered will be available on the Indiaspora site pretty soon, and we'll be sending that link to all participants right after this event. And now I'm delighted to have Milan Vaishnav be our moderator today, and I know he has an eminent panel, and looks like all his panelists are ready to go. So Milan, over to you.
Thank you, MR. And I want to just take a minute to thank Diaspora for hosting this event, and for Karthik and his colleagues for the excellent work that they've been doing, not just this election cycle, but for several election cycles on the issue of Asian Americans, Indian Americans, and their political attitudes. We have an excellent panel to debate and discuss some of the issues that Karthik has previewed for us already. So let me just quickly introduce our panelists, and we'll jump right into the conversation. Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi was elected in November 2016 to represent the 8th District in Illinois. That includes the west and the northwest suburbs of Chicago. The congressman serves on the Oversight Committee as well as on the House Intelligence Committee. He also serves as Assistant Whip and on the Steering and Policy Committee. Niraj Antani is serving his 3rd term in the Ohio House of Representatives. He represents the 42nd District of Ohio, which covers most of southern Montgomery County. He is one of the youngest currently serving members of the House, the 2nd Indian American state official in Ohio history, and the very first Indian American Republican. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. But last and certainly not least is Seema Nanda, who is visiting fellow at the Harvard Law School Labor and Work-Life program. She previously served as CEO of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. She has years of experience working in and out of government on issues of civil rights, human rights, and labor. I want to welcome all 3 of you to this discussion. Good to be with you. Congressman Krishnamoorthi, let me start with you. Thank you for taking the time out of a very busy campaign season. The data which Karthik has shown us shows that around 66% of Indian Americans plan to support your party's candidate, Joe Biden, this November. While this share is high, it's actually somewhat down from the 84% that supported Obama in 2012 and the 77% who supported Hillary Clinton in 2016. Meanwhile, President Trump's vote share has gone up from 16% to 28%. Now, there are some caveats here. There is a margin of error that's around plus or minus 6 percentage points. Those other surveys I referenced were post-election surveys rather than pre-election surveys. But let me put this question to you. Do you think that there is evidence that Democrats should be worried about Indian American voter attrition?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me, Milan?
Yep.
Okay, very good. It's great to see Seema and Niraj and MR and Sanjeev and Karthik. Great job, and I'm honored to join you for a little bit of time. I think Democrats absolutely should be concerned about making sure that they conduct sufficient outreach to Indian Americans, that they conduct sufficient outreach to the different groups that comprise Desis and Indian Americans, because every vote is going to count, especially in those battleground states. I think that as the survey results indicated, there are a lot of Indian Americans in, for instance, Pennsylvania and Michigan and Florida and North Carolina, among others. And they could, in conjunction with especially other Asian American groups, but certainly themselves, be part of the tipping factor. And because of that, I think the Biden campaign has to be especially attentive. That all being said, I do think that Indian Americans will come home to the Democratic Party because of a couple big issues that they are very concerned about that I think Democrats address well. One is dealing with the pandemic. I think that is by far the most pressing issue facing Americans, and handling it in a nonpartisan and practical way and killing the virus is absolutely paramount. I think they think that Joe Biden and Democrats do a good job. And then on the other 2 issues, immigration and access to public education, I think those are also issues that are ones that Indian Americans tend to side with Democrats on. But that being said, I think that Joe Biden absolutely has to conduct a vigorous outreach here.
Niraj, let me just come to you on this. You know, when it comes to party identification, independents accounted for about 35% of Indian American voters in 2016, but only about 24% this time around. And Democrats seem to have been the biggest beneficiary in terms of identification. So at least on this metric, you know, the Indian swing voters don't seem to closely affiliate with the Republican Party to say, hey, you know, I'm a member of this group. Why not?
Well, thank you. Thanks for moderating, and thanks MR and in Diaspora for having me. And Congressman, great to virtually see you, and Seema, great to be on with you as well. Look, I think I'm under no illusions, as the Congressman said, that Indian Americans tend to be democratic, right? Tend to be more liberal, but I think, as you said, there's a swath of voters who are Indian American who could go either way. And I think that, obviously the president is a polarizing figure. I think probably one of the more polarizing that we have ever seen. And so I think, it's hard to not have an opinion, right? A Mitt Romney, a John McCain, even probably a Barack Obama or a Hillary Clinton, I think there's a lot of persuasion, sort of in that. But with the president, I think there's not. And I think that, I think you've seen sort of his support increase, but also amongst Indian Americans, but also, like you said, Democrats sort of get a lot of swing voters. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I think that, again, the president's outreach and going to India and, standing with the prime minister and neutrality on issues like CAA and the abrogation of 370, as opposed to Vice President Biden's opposition to those issues, has sort of polarized the community. And I think that's why you're seeing what the data shows.
Seema, let me ask you about this issue of turnout. One of the things that Karthik and his colleagues point out in this report, and I thought one of the most interesting statistics, is that, in many battleground states, not least my state of Texas, which has 161,000 Indian American voters, Indian Americans could make a real play. And when you look at their history of turnout, in the report, it mentions that Indian American turnout almost doubled from the midterms in 2014 to the midterms in 2018. What do you think accounts for this massive surge we've seen in Indian American political participation?
Sure. Well, it's great to be with everybody. And Karthik, your research is wonderful. And so thank you for performing this service. I think what you see with turnout in 2018 in general, turnout was so much higher across the general population and certainly across AAPI populations. But the interesting thing about Indian American turnout from 2014 to 2018 is Indian American turnout went from 26% to 47%, catching up to the general population. So in the general population was 36% in 14, and in 18 it was 47%. So that's a staggering statistic to really see kind of the awakening of the Indian American community and really catching up to the general population. And I think it can really be attributed to the results of the 2016 election. I mean, I think you really saw people wake up and see what happens when we don't all vote, when we don't all participate. And Indian Americans, it's a rapidly growing community. The community has more than doubled since the year 2000. So you have a growing community, and you also have a community that's growing in its political awareness and its political activism. But one of the most fascinating things that I saw in leading the Democratic Party was just so many grassroots groups of Indian Americans, a lot of women doing the work on the ground. And if you talk to a lot of these folks, and I'll say women, but there's some men too, but you talk to a lot of these women and they didn't do any of this before 16. So the election of Trump was a mobilizing moment for the Indian American community that I think we're going to really see play out in 2020.
On this question of kind of enthusiasm, Congressman, let me come back to you. There is a narrative out there, I'm sure you've heard it. I hear it from some of my Indian American friends, that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will not be good for India. And they cite two facts. The first is Senator Harris's comments seeming to criticize India's decision to abrogate Article 370 in Kashmir. And the second is her outspokenness in defense of and support of Representative Pramila Jayapal when the Indian foreign minister, for lack of a better term, sort of snubbed a meeting of members of Congress when she was attending. And this seems to be a narrative that won't really die. I want to give you an opportunity to take this on. Do you think that Indian Americans have something to worry about when it comes to US policy towards India if the Biden-Harris ticket comes to the White House in January?
Absolutely not. One of the interesting facts about Joe Biden is that he was the one who helped to shepherd the US-India nuclear accord through Congress and through the Senate when he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at a time when it was very difficult to assess the prospects of that particular accord. But he navigated it successfully, and he has been a stalwart friend of India through different prime ministers. And of course, President Barack Obama had a very close relationship with Narendra Modi, as you know. But let me just, I want to pan out for 1 second, which is that I have to say that the US-India relationship at this point, I believe, is bipartisan or nonpartisan. It transcends partisan differences in this sense that it's growing stronger, it's growing deeper, broader, and it is taking on kind of new importance, especially with regard to our own country's views of our national security vis-a-vis the Chinese government in the Indo-Pacific region. And for that reason, as a member of the House Intelligence Committee, I can tell you for a fact that our national security is bound up with the security of India. And as a consequence, and because of the growing relationship, I think that Joe Biden, along with future presidents, will grow closer and closer to the governments of India. And I think that's a natural progression.
Niraj, let me put this to you. The Trump campaign has made a lot of efforts, frankly, to reach out to Indian Americans, including putting together a nice video advertisement featuring Prime Minister Modi at Howdy Modi in Houston last September, showing the camaraderie between the President of the United States and Prime Minister of India. But when the rubber meets the road and Indian Americans go to vote on election day, how important do you think these questions of foreign policy are going to be compared to bread and butter issues like the economy, like jobs, like healthcare, like education? Do you think that they rate highly for Indian American voters? Oh, you're on mute, Niraj.
I think there's a segment of the Indian American community where it does. I'm not saying that it's all of them, and frankly, I do think that the Democratic position on the abrogation of 370 and on CAA has caused a swath of Indian Americans to be more supportive of Republicans and the president. I do, but I would also go forward and say I think the economy is a big deal as well. I think that the president's tax cuts and Jobs Act, I think made a difference. And when Indian Americans are small business owners, of whether they're hotels or another small business, I think that they saw direct benefits from that. And so I think both between foreign policy and with the economic state, I'm not going to argue with the data that Dr. Ramakrishna showed about healthcare and immigration and a couple of these other issues. But I think on foreign policy and on the economy, the president has shown a record. And again, I mean, let's be very clear. He's not winning the Indian American vote, right? He's at what, 28%. But that is, as you have said, a marked difference from 2016. And so I guess what I'm just trying to explain is that, jump of double-digit percentage, I think, is attributable to these two things, right? I'm not saying that that will necessarily get us to over 50%, but when we're talking about in Ohio, right, these most important swing state in America, the 2016 election came down to 2 votes per precinct, right? If Hillary Clinton could have changed 2 votes per precinct, they would have won Ohio. Well, then when we're talking about, and I think it was the congressman who said it, or maybe it was Seema, but Detroit and Fort Lauderdale and Philadelphia, well, the Indian American community becomes very, very important, and I would even say Cleveland. You're talking about thousands, if not tens of thousands of votes, that are up for play, and I think that I don't know that it's going to go from 28% to 70%, but if it's all about creating a coalition, right? And so if he can go from 28% to 38%, well, that could be part of a coalition to win a state.
Seema, let me ask you, you were CEO of the Democratic National Committee. You worked with candidates around the country to try to get them elected. You saw them interact with voters, with interest groups, with candidates. If we take these numbers at face value, that in fact the Republican Party has made maybe modest inroads with in the Indian American community, how would you advise the Democratic establishment today, with another month and a half before the election, in order to kind of make sure that this group stays with the party, votes for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris? What are the things they need to do between now and Election Day?
Well, I would say pick up a point that Congressman Krishnamoorthi made in his opening remarks. Outreach, outreach, outreach. And I will say we can take absolutely nothing for granted. I mean, we lost the 2016 election by 70,000 votes across the Midwest states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. 10,000 votes in Michigan. The Indian American vote is 10 times that. So that's why every single vote is going to matter. And you see an overrepresentation of Indian Americans in these battleground states. And what we've seen actually the Biden-Harris campaign doing now is exactly that. They are doing this outreach. They're doing it often. They are talking to voters. But I think it is a vote that this research shows absolutely cannot be taken for granted. One thing I will say about inroads, having just said nothing can be taken for granted, is, at the same time, while Dr. Karthik's research shows that the support for Biden might be lower, before than after it was for Clinton, we're also seeing that the Indian Americans aren't going more for the Republican Party. So in 2016, you had 19% identifying as Republicans. Now you have 16% identifying as Republicans, whereas in that same time period for Democrats, it went from 46% to 54%. So you still see a growth as those who identify as Democrats in the Indian American community. How those independents show up is going to be the question, and what we all need to keep working on.
Congressman, let me ask you about the Kamala Harris factor, because that's been something a lot of Indian Americans have talked about, some positive, some negative. But the conventional wisdom, if one could kind of boil it down, is that the selection of Senator Harris as Biden's vice presidential pick may not necessarily change a lot of minds. We know about polarization. We know about sorting. We know that at least when it comes to Indian Americans, not that many are undecided, according to Karthik's work. But it could have a measurable impact on turnout. In other words, it might get more people to come out in the polls because they're excited for a variety of reasons. She's Indian American. She's African American. She's a woman. She has an impressive record. What's your take on what you think the impact of that pick is going to be on the Democrats' fortunes this fall?
Well, on the Democrats' fortunes, I think it's a huge plus. You see it in all kinds of metrics, whether it's fundraising, whether it's the engagement. It's palpable. Her addition to the ticket made a big difference in those and other areas. With regard to Indian Americans, I think that you know, you see pictures of her family, you see your own family in those pictures. It's really quite striking. And what I'd like to see her do is talk a little bit more about her biography, talk about her Indian heritage and her roots, and talk about how that informed and influenced who she is today. Because I think that fleshing out that biography, which makes sense now, I mean, she's at a place where she's still introducing herself to a lot of people, will have a lot of advantages, especially in helping to deepen that outreach that we were talking about to the Indian American community and exciting people. Imagine, you know, on the day that she's sworn in as Vice President of the United States, Indian American girls and boys are going to wake up around America and think, I can be Vice President and maybe I can be President someday. And that is incredibly exciting. And I've spoken to her many times, and I can tell you that her Indian heritage and roots really do have a profound kind of impact on her, from the type of cuisine that she prefers to her approach. And I think that she needs to talk about that. That would be very, very beneficial to the Biden-Harris campaign.
Niraj, on this question of kind of Indian American preferences, we were talking about this a little bit before the conversation went live. You know, there is an argument out there that the Indian American community is pretty significantly divided along generational lines, and that younger Indian Americans tend to be more liberal, more progressive, and frankly, not as happy about the trajectory or direction of India under Prime Minister Modi. We know from the work of Devesh Kapoor that about 150,000 Indian Americans become newly eligible to vote every single year, right? That's not an insignificant number. Do you think that there is something for the Republican Party to worry about as the demographics in this country shift, and we see more and more Indian Americans, young Indian Americans, coming out and being eligible to vote?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, in addition to being one of the few Indian American elected officials in the country, I'm also, as you said, you know, now the third youngest in Ohio, and I was for 4 years the youngest. And so
I should mention, I think Niraj was first elected at the age of 23. Is that right?
23, right, 23. So, you know, in addition to sort of, you know, urging my party to do better in outreach to minority communities, specifically, obviously the Indian community, I'm also very involved in urging our party to do better with young voters. And I would say that that data is not, and that generational divide is not necessarily an Indian problem. It's a voter problem. Every community, doesn't matter what, you know, race or ethnicity, it is a problem. We are struggling and have struggled for a long time with the youth vote, and we will continue to until something changes. And I have, you know, a plethora of ideas in that segment. But I would say that I really don't know that that's sort of an ethnic issue as far as being Indian or not. I think that's more of a generic, you know, party versus party issue. You know, same thing for women, right? You know, I don't know that it's an Indian women issue. I think that it is a women issue. It might be that, you know, Indians tend to live it more in the suburbs. And so, you know, perhaps Indian women are more, you know, and sort of shown in these polls. But, you know, the Republicans have a problem with women, with young voters, with minority voters. And we have a lot of ground to make up with, you know, those segments. But I don't think on the youth vote issue, it's really an Indian issue. I think it's more just, you know, party versus party.
Seema, let me ask you a question, then I'll end by asking each of you the same question, then we'll turn it over to the audience. You know, one of the data points that comes from this report is that a quarter, 25% of Indian Americans that were surveyed contributed money to a candidate, a party, or some campaign organization this election cycle, and that's just to date. You know, a cynic might argue that, you know, Indian Americans are now being showered with all of this love from politicians, and because they're finally opening up their pocketbooks. Do you think this has some truth to it?
I actually don't think it has truth to it. I think what you really see across certainly the Democratic Party, but across the Republican Party as well, is you see campaigns that are more and more powered by the grassroots. Now, that's not to say that large donors don't have a place in the party, that they don't matter, that it's not still important without major campaign finance reform happening. But you see, most of what's powering Joe Biden's campaign is grassroots donors. So I really think there is an awakening that Asian Americans and Indian Americans in particular can be the margin of victory. And I think there was a lot of really going to school at a lot of the races in 2018 and looking at what happened in 2016 and saying, if we had gotten to this community earlier, if we had done more outreach, if we had sort of seen what are the things that really interest that community and how are we talking about our issues, could that have been the margin of victory? I think that's what you really see happening. And you see representation, which I think helps put in the forefront that there is this community. You see representation in Congress, you see representation in the party, you see representation of Indian Americans leading progressive groups and other political organizations. So I think it's a broader awakening of the political movement.
So let me just end before we turn it over to the audience by asking each of you one question, and I'll go with you first, Congressman. Indian Americans have made their presence felt not just as voters, but as candidates, right? And you and Niraj are testament to that. If there's one race at any level of government that deserves closer scrutiny and in which an Indian American candidate is on the ballot, other than your own race, what would it be? What is that Indian American race that you're really excited about this fall?
Oh,
I think you're on mute, Congressman.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Maybe I should have just muted myself. I shouldn't. I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Milan. No, look, I think that as I have mentioned before, I'm one of a handful of Indian Americans in Congress, and I affectionately call us the Samosa Caucus, Milan. And I always say we need more samosas and pakoras and idlis and vades in Congress, and we need them now. We need a Congress that looks like America. And so I pay a special attention to congressional races that have Indian Americans, but people of all ethnicities. I'm excited about all of the ones that feature Indian Americans. There are a couple that are now doing it a second time in a row. And I excuse me if I omit somebody that might have done it a second time in a row as well, but at least I'm aware that both Sri Kulkarni and Hiral Tiperneni are both running for a second time. They're both red to blue candidates in our party, which means that they are considered to be in some of the top tier races in the country. But Milan, obviously the race that we're all paying especially close attention to that involves an Indian American is the Biden-Harris race. And so that's where obviously we're also, pinning our hopes for a victory too.
Niraj, what about you? Oh, you're on mute.
I would agree with, the congressman that, obviously the presidential race is interesting. And just to expound on something he said earlier, I do sort of as an Indian American, but also specifically as an Indian American Republican, I think it'll be very interesting to see how Senator Harris sort of talks about her Indian heritage over the next, 49, 50 days. And I am, we obviously saw what she said in the convention, but I'll be interested to see if they do that, more, and if they target, sort of her Indian heritage to, Indian populations in swing states. And then, the other, I would agree with, Congressman about, Sri Kulkarni and Hiral. I think that, Sri probably has a much better shot than hero, especially as, the incumbent in Shree's race is no longer running. But, my favorite race every year to watch is Raja Krishnamurthy's. That's really
Good answer. Good answer. I like that. Thank you.
Who says bipartisanship isn't possible, right?
Raja may not want to claim me, but we're friends. So.
Seema, what about you?
So I'm going to double down on everything that's been said. Huge fan of Senator Harris, obviously, and that is the race. But I will say this about both Harold and Shree. If you sit down with these folks, they are two of the smartest, most thoughtful people you will ever meet. And they're both on red to blue, and they would both be incredible candidates. One thing I'll point out about Shree's race, and this is Texas 22. The reason I'd say this is the race to watch is because what Shree has done in that district. He has one of the most diverse districts in the country. And he lost that race in 2018 by just under 5 points. And the reason that race was so close, when everyone told him when he started that this race was unwinnable, is because he set out to change the electorate. And that meant he ran his campaign in about 18 languages, figured out not just how to disaggregate the AAPI community, but where was the Indian American community from? What language did the diverse people in his community speak? And then he would have staffers reach out to those folks in language. So he has done incredible work actually expanding the electorate and changing who can vote in his district, who is registered to vote. So I think that's an incredibly interesting one to watch, because I think it will, whether he wins or loses, and I think he's going to make it to the top this year. Congressman Olson is retiring, so it's going to be an open seat. But it's a really interesting race because someone can actually go about changing the electorate and not saying, oh, this is AAPIs don't vote, or Latinx Americans don't vote. Everyone can vote if we reach out to them early and actually say, no, this is your country too. You're all a part of it.
I'm going to hand it over to MR. I'm surprised no one mentioned Sarah Gideon, who's running a very interesting Senate race in the state of Maine. So that's the one that I'm watching. But thanks for all of you for joining. I think we have questions now, MR?
Yeah. Thank you, Milan, for moderating. I know, Raja, you may have to leave. So let us know when you're leaving. But we have so many questions. We have 47 questions for you guys. So I'll try to aggregate them, consolidate them. So Raja, stay as long as you can, and free to leave whenever you want.
Great. I can handle a question, and then I probably have to jump.
Great. So the first question I'm consolidating is around the area of immigration. So there are many categories of immigration here involved: the H-1B visas, the green card to citizenship issue, and the third one are the undocumented Indians. And so this is a big issue that is important to the community, but would love to get a little bit more clarification from both sides as to how they want to work on this big issue for us. Whoever wants to go.
Actually, I know you have to jump, so go ahead.
Okay, well, look, this is one of those issues where I think that the Democratic Party has traditionally led, and it's leading again. I think with regard to high-skilled immigrants, and specifically H-1Bs, kind of the number one issue that we have to deal with is removing the per-country caps that otherwise, keep Indian nationals primarily from becoming green card holders in a timely way. If you are an H-1B holder from India and you came over today, it would take you 70 years, meaning 70 years, to become a green card holder. It's absolutely unacceptable. And so We have put forward legislation that passed through the House. It's my bill, which won on a bipartisan majority. It's stuck in the Senate and the White House is not interested. So that's one big piece of legislation that I think that Joe Biden is going to tackle, and it's part of his agenda platform on his website, by the way. So it really matters. With regard to undocumented immigrants, we all know that he has presented a pathway to citizenship over time for these folks. And for DACA, those are children of undocumented immigrants who came here. There is a more of an expedited pathway to citizenship as well. I think that, if we're not going to insource talent, we're going to outsource work. That is what immigration is all about right now. And I think the Biden-Harris ticket has it right. And I think that they're going to attract a lot of votes because of that.
Thank you. Niraj, I think you wanted to comment.
Sorry about that. Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think that obviously, we should separate, the issue of legal immigration versus illegal immigration. On illegal immigration, I think, you can look at the data, but I do think that there's a split of Indian Americans and their views on illegal immigration. My personal view is that, my parents came here the legal way, and thus, so should others. Now, I think, we also understand that, there should be a pathway to, legal residency. I'm not for a pathway to citizenship, but a pathway to legal residency. But on, I try to spend more of my time on, my thoughts on the legal side of the coin. Now, obviously, it's a federal issue, but, there is, I think, a battle, in the Republican Party on this issue. The Fairness in High Skilled Immigration Act, has had a lot of Republican support. Ken Buck from Colorado, who's a Republican, I think Mike Lee in the Senate and others, but has also run into, both Republican and Democratic opposition. I think, Senator Schumer and Senator Rick Scott from Florida. And so, but we also saw, a Jeff Sessions who, I was very happy who, lost his primary, but, there very much is a battle in the Republican Party about, views on H-1B issues, views on, more legal immigration versus not. And I obviously side on, more legal immigration is good. And I do think that, those of us in the Republican Party are having that, sort of internal battle right now. And we have, definitely a lot of work to do in that realm.
Thanks.
I have to go.
Rajat, thank you so much. Appreciate you coming in, and all the best on November 3rd for your own race.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care. The next question that's come up, and a few questions I've consolidated that have come up around Indian American, but this other category called Hindu American. And just want to, Seema, get your take on that. I know you used to be the CEO of the DNC and stuff. So what is the perspective of a Hindu American, meaning it's more than just Indians, because there are Hindus from many other countries surrounding India as well, like Nepal and many others. So Sri Lanka and others. So what do you think of how that should be handled?
Sure. I mean, I think, there's certainly a lot of overlapping interests. You have Hindu Americans who are not Indian Americans or even South Asian necessarily, but you also have a large overlap in the group. I think one thing about outreach from the party is it's important to meet people where they are in terms of how they identify. Some people identify as both South Asian and Asian American and Pacific Islander and Indian American and Hindu American. I will take all of those identities, but some people really don't see themselves in those groups. So I think it's important to have different ways that you're talking about people, so that you're talking about them. But certainly, I think what you see with Joe Biden is you see someone who has, over the course of his career, really done outreach to the Indian American community, from his work, as the congressman said, on the nuclear deal, to doing things like he and President Obama were the first to actually start celebrating Diwali in the White House. So I think you really see that commitment from the vice president throughout his career. I wanted to say one thing about your immigration related question, because it's not just the green card backlog, which is appalling right now and needs attention for sure, and is certainly on Joe Biden's platform. But it's also what you see with this president. It's not just the attack on undocumented immigrants. He is attacking immigrants, just immigrants, legal immigration, starting with the Muslim ban. But also what you see happening at USCIS is you see major slowdowns in processing. You see a lot more denials on things that used to be pretty routinely going through. And it's kind of the silent killer, because it's not like you actually see this wall going up, but you see them erecting these barriers to legal immigration as well. And I think it's important, Karthik has pointed out in the chat, that actually Indian Americans are the largest Asian American DACA group, and very supportive of pathways to legalization as well.
Great, thank you. The next question really is posed by some of the independents who are in the audience, including me, which is there's so much vitriol between the two parties today, and that really turns people off. You know, when we see two people just get on TV and fight with each other. So what is it going to take to bring civility back into this process, like we've had pretty much during this call? What's it going to take, Niraj, from your side? And then I'd love to hear from Seema as well.
Yeah,
please weigh in.
I think that is a great question. There's certainly, you know, a large swath of independent voters who are turned off by the partisanship, but there are a lot of partisan voters who like the partisanship. And so, you know, I think, you know, for me personally, you know, I've always said, how do you disagree without being disagreeable, right? However, in the political sense, wedge issues and wedging people, and frankly, division, can be an effective political strategy. And so, you know, I think that there's a sort of inherent conflict there, that, you know, the division works politically, but there's also a large segment of independent voters who, you know, want to see unity. You know, I think that it also depends on the election cycle you're in, right? You know, when you're talking about, you know, Mitt Romney versus President Obama, I think that, you know, there was a lot of persuasion to be had. And so, you know, perhaps, you know, the partisanship wasn't as much. This election, I really believe, is more of a turnout election, that, you know, there's probably not that many, and I think, you know, the polling data shows that, not that many people who don't have their mind made up. And so it's really about turning out, you know, your voters, and therefore the partisanship, you know, works. And so, you know, I think there's a long way to go. I will say, you know, as a state legislator, you know, our partisanship is not nearly as bad as what you see in DC, but, you know, there are a lot of differences. The question is how do you focus on, you know, the politics and not the personal, right? Is when it becomes personal, it gets bad. And that's, you know, what I think, you know, people should try to stay away from.
Great. Milan, a question for you. There was several questions around down ballot races and how this might play out. Do you have some thoughts on that? Because, you know, people like Raja and Niraj, they are all the down ballot races, and some of it could depend, not in their maybe particular instances, could depend on the turnout and who is going to vote for Biden or Trump. A lot of the down ballot races are impacted by that, right? Any thoughts?
No,
on
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, you know, I think Seema hit the nail on the head when she said that the thing that matters the most for the Democratic Party is outreach, 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 and that's what they've got to focus on in the next month and a half. And I think that, you know, the reason that I asked the question about Senator Harris is because I do think that there is the prospect of not necessarily changing minds, but incentivizing people to go out and vote for the very reason that she is a historic candidate on many levels. Just to say a word quickly about the previous question on partisanship, I think one of the interesting things we're starting to see here is that India has become a very polarized political space. And those cleavages of polarization in India are finding their representation in our own politics in America. If you have a conversation with your Indian friends about India, it quickly goes to Mr. Modi. And when you get to Mr. Modi, you get to discussions that can be quite heated. People have very strong feelings on him. And I think that's something which is worth exploring. To what extent are we seeing some of that polarization dynamic get even more complicated, because it's not just within the four corners of the country, but in fact is borrowing something from what's happening in India.
Got it. Any other comments on that from Seema or Niraj on the down ballot races and what's going on?
Well, I can just speak that it absolutely affects, those of us that are down the ballot, unless, Shri, I think, has done a good job of it, but it's very difficult down the ballot to affect turnout. But, you are at the mercy of top of the ticket, and you just have to run ahead. I can tell you that I'm running 3 points ahead of the president in my district. It's a historically Republican district, but I'm still, running 3 points ahead of him, which, we like and would like to increase that. But, you just have to do your best to try to run ahead of the top of the ticket.
Yeah, and I'll just add, certainly it can work both ways. Sometimes the top of the ballot can really bring up down ballot candidates, and sometimes down ballot candidates are really getting the grassroots enthused and can really help the top of the ticket. So there's really interesting pockets of opportunity there. I just want to say a quick word on your question about civility amongst the parties and the polarization. I think the number one thing we can do to halt polarization in our country is elect Joe Biden. And I say that not because I'm a partisan, which I totally recognize I am, but you do have a presidency that seeks to divide, and he has made it part of his agenda to basically divide groups, turn them against each other, not talk to, California is burning, Oregon is burning, Washington State is burning. But that's not on his agenda because those are not his voters. So I think when you have a party that doesn't even have a platform anymore, you need another party if you want to have stability in politics, and you need to have a president who brings some integrity to the process, which I think you'll have with Joe Biden.
Great. A lot of questions on COVID. I know Karthik had put up some data on COVID. So a couple of questions on COVID relate around the mortality rates that have been the highest have been in Democratic-run states. And so how do you reconcile this versus the national kind of policy and so forth? Because in these states, governors have jurisdiction over how things are done, and mayors and such. So question is, how do you reconcile the COVID responses from a federal versus the states where there have been a lot more cases like New York and others? Any thoughts?
So what you see a lot with the way COVID has grown is you've seen in population centers that are more heavily dense, like places like New York and Michigan had earlier rise in cases, and then you've really seen COVID cases rising in the South. But so it's not necessarily who's in charge. It's sort of like when are cases peaking. But I think throughout it all, what's most, it's beyond troubling. It's just catastrophic and horrendous that, nearly 200,000 Americans have to die to something that most of the rest of the developed world and most of the world in general has been able to get much more under control, is a complete lack of leadership. The president's lack of interest in science and data is really coming through. Everything from telling people not to wear masks, from still telling people that the reason our numbers are going up is because we're doing too much testing, to sending children, trying to order governors to send children back to school without a plan. And you still don't see the testing. So I think what we see is a lack of national planning, lack of early national planning, and still to date, he doesn't have a plan, which I think is something that with Joe Biden, we have early, he has a deep recognition in what experts mean, but it's not so easy to say it's, one place or the other, because you really have a lack of national leadership and you have these different growth rates depending on when the pandemic hit earliest.
So Niraj, how's the COVID situation in Ohio, and how's that been handled?
Yeah, obviously it is not good anywhere, both from a health and, economic standpoint. I've talked to Indian American restaurant owners who are struggling, but, also obviously many Indian American physicians who are on the front lines trying to do their job. And, I know of quite a few who, not only in Ohio, but across the country, who have contracted the virus and are still struggling. And so, certainly both from a health and economic perspective, we have a lot of work to do. It is pretty much an administrative function. Obviously we in the legislature have provided a variety of funding and other, resources and suspension of sort of regulatory, different regulatory rules. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work still to do. I mean, people, think that, I think, I don't want to use the word new normal, but use the term new normal, but there are still people dying. There are still businesses struggling. There are still Indian American businesses struggling, and there's still Indian American physicians on the front line that, we have to pay attention to. And I spend, now a significant amount of my time trying to help, those individuals navigate, the bureaucracy that is our state government to try to get them relief.
Great. I think we're way out of time, and I want to respect both your schedules, all three of your schedules. But I want to just close by bringing up our team. If you don't mind, Sanjeev, Mansi, and Rucha, if you could put your videos on and come back on if you don't mind. I want to embarrass all of you. And just want to thank Sanjeev, our executive director at Indiaspora, and Mansi Patel and Rucha, who are ably put this whole thing together in a seamless way, and want to give them a hand. So thank you so much. And also to Milan for moderating a terrific panel here. We could have gone on and on. I think we left about 40 questions unanswered, but that would take way too much time. And to Niraj, good luck in your race. And I hope you get 10 points ahead of the president and you win in a landslide. Really want to wish you the best. And Seema, good luck. I know you're now at the Kennedy School, but we hope to see you more politically engaged in the future as well. And so I want to thank everyone for this. And the report will be on our website. If you want to take more detailed look at all the numbers that we went through and discussed, it's going to be on our website. And this recording will be on Facebook Live on the Indiaspora page. In case any of your friends missed it, you can go back to Facebook and see it, and we'll put it up on YouTube pretty soon as well. So once again, this concludes the Vote 2020 session for Indiaspora, and I want to thank everyone and wish you a good night. Thank you.